Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode, we're excited to talk about what we call the Fab Five. We're going to be talking about the 5 most important KPIs. For the viewers who don't know what a KPI is, that's key performance indicator. So these are like metric points to look at your business, to see how you're doing, to see the health of your business. So that's going to be the topic of today's episode. We're really excited to talk about it. Kind of jumping in to our first KPI is, as simple as it sounds, collections. Omar, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about collections and why that's a very important KPI?
Yeah. So obviously, we all know what collections are. Collections is revenue, right? The money is coming in the bank. Where we start really using this KPI and actually start moving the needle is by having goals, right? So what should our collection goal be for this month, for this quarter, for this year, right? Where were we before, and where we trying to move the needle to? If we set a goal, we have a 90% chance of moving the needle higher than not having a goal. Just think about it the same as if you're going to the gym and you have a goal. I want to hit this much in weight, so if I want to hit this much in cardio or this much in calories, why is everyone counting steps nowadays, right? Setting goals is a very easy way to move the needle in the right way. And then so if we have a collection goal, now we know what we need to target, and then you start going downstream. So what do I mean by downstream? So you look at the collection goal and you say, okay, well, how do I get to that number, and what things I need to tweak in my process to achieve that number? So you start looking into mini metrics, right? Like okay, what is my case acceptance rate? So are we educating the patient properly? If our case acceptance rate isn't at average or above average, then it means that we're probably not doing the best job educating the patient on the importance of that procedure and what can happen if we don't perform that procedure, if we don't move forward with this case. Looking at, okay, well, how many calls are we getting for appointments and new patient count per month? What should that number be? If we're spending more on marketing, then we should be having a much higher number. What should that number be, and how is that translating into appointments? Looking at our appointment count and saying, okay, well, what percentage of our appointments are no-shows? We all hate that, right? And we all hate the fact that, okay, we've got a full schedule, looks great, and all of a sudden 3 people don't show up. Okay, well, how many times will they reach out to? What is a reappointment rate? That if somebody comes in for an appointment, has a procedure, has hygiene work done, and then we are, booking them for their next appointment before they leave the office. And how often are we following up with them to make sure they're going to show up for the appointment, right? And if they pick up the phone and say, oh, I totally forgot, I've got to take my daughter to soccer practice or something, well, then, let's rebook you, right? All of these things, which is what I like to call downstream KPIs, that all support the main KPI, which is our collection goal. All right. So somebody, comes to us and say, okay, well, my collections is down, or I just can't get the number up. Well, I challenge them to say, okay, well, look at it downstream and look at every single number and see where is the problem. And I'm pretty sure you're going to find somewhere there's a breakage, right, within that. And so that's really, the importance of, it's a very easy number to track. What is collections? But collections versus goal, how is the goal translated? And if we're not hitting the goal, what is a treatment plan to make sure the fact that we are able to optimize that goal, right? That's our first one. What else do we have?
The next KPI I want to talk about is staff cost, and specifically not including the owner cost, right? And, the KPI we use for that would be 20 to 30%, right, of collections. Now, of course, if you're a newer practice, this percentage is going to be much higher, right, as you're growing the practice and trying to improve and increase collections. Obviously, for the longer standing practices, this number is going to be a little bit lower as you've got collections up. Payroll is kind of staying at a low. But then as you build your infrastructure and you have longer tenured employees, right, and you're having raises every year and things like that, then you're going to see that payroll cost is going to kind of go up right into the middle line. And so I said 20 to 30% is the range, but the sweet spot is like 25%. And so when I was talking about newer practices, you're going to be closer to 30% or a little bit higher. More standing and existing practices early on, as they've fixed that collections, might be closer to 20% and they're lean. But then, like I said, when you build that infrastructure, you have longer tenure employees, then you're going to sort of level up, right, and be around that 25% spot, which is the sweet spot for us, when it comes to staff cost.
And that's really important how you notate that, because there's 2 things when it comes to that KPI that we see that doctors kind of show them getting their hands around, right? First is the fact that they may look at their staff costs and say, oh, I'm doing awesome, right? But then it's like, okay, well, what are you incorporating into that staff cost? Are you incorporating contractors? Incorporating, everyone fully loaded into that number? Or sometimes they'll include themselves in that number. And I'm like, okay, well, what is a fair compensation for you, right? And how does that play into the staff cost number? Secondly is people taking drastic measures. So if they're looking at their P&L and they've got pulled up some KPIs from somewhere and staff costs up really, really high, but it's a young practice. They're like, oh, I can start cutting, labor. But what they're not understanding is the fact that, okay, well, that's the infancy of stage of the practice, right? So you're going to have, like, come to set higher numbers, the higher range. You may even be in the 35% range, right? Because your just numbers aren't there. But if you're going to be super lean on staff, you're not going to be able to grow. So you have to have a trade-off, right? Now, if consistently, even as you're growing, your staff cost maintains at the higher end of the spectrum, now we've got an issue. But as any company trying to grow, you have to invest in the right people to basically be able to free yourself up so you can maximize your time doing production. And so, yes, that KPI is important, but it's also very important to tether with that, to tie into that. What stage of the practice are you at? And how long have you been in that stage of that practice, right? That's a very important question to ask yourself. And then you can get a real good idea of, okay, how do I measure it up against this KPI?
Right. I think that's a great point to make. The next KPI I want to talk about is variable cost. Right now, we say that should be typically 15 to 20%, depending on the stage of your practice. Things like variable cost is things like supplies and lab. Omar, did you want to talk a little bit more about that KPI and why it's important to look at it?
Yeah. So that's one of the areas where you can really do a lot of tweaking, right? Because you have control over what you're purchasing, you have control over the labs that you're choosing, and a lot of practices we're seeing nowadays are actually going in and say, okay, we're bringing lab in-house, right? Now there's a certain revenue number you want to be at before you make an investment, but that is something I like to call that's controllable, right? How much are we doing in wastage? Are we buying in bulk? There are a lot of efficient practices that we have. We see the fact that they really focus on that number, and then trimming that by a couple percentage points drives money to the bottom line. That's just pure savings that adds to your profitability, adds to the value of your office. Bulk buying, control over inventory, control over supplies that are running in the office, not just having a system where, okay, if we're out, then we're just going to reorder. Well, how much are we really using, right? And lab costs, we're continuing to see that trend of practices once they've crossed that $1.5 million, threshold, they're investing in equipment in-house. What we've heard is the fact that not only are they getting a better quality product, but because they know exactly what's going into that lab, into that piece that they're making for the patient, because they know what materials are going in there. It's high quality materials. They're controlling the materials that are going into the molding of that piece. Along with that, they're able to control the process, and they're able to control the costs, right? And obviously, as you guys are all practicing doctors know, the fact that you have same-day turnaround, right? Versus having to send it out, have the patient come back a week and a half later to get it. It's just, you're wasting a lot of, staff time, right? And so that's kind of how we look at the variable costs KPI.
Right. The next KPI I want to talk about, which is fixed cost. The range I give for that is anywhere from 15 to 30%. And again, as I've mentioned a couple of times, you're depending on where you stand in your practice, right? A younger practice might be at the higher end, and a more existing practice might be at the lower end, more lean, right? Now, things in fixed costs, these are things like rent, G&A, general administrative things, subscription cost. You can even put marketing in there, right? When we're analyzing that, we put marketing in there, right? And so, as I mentioned, where you stand in your practice is where your range could be, right? And that's why it's 15 to 30%. To get more specific, if we talk about rent, for example, rent, we like to say 5 to 9%, right? And I'd say the more optimal percentage, the sweet spot is 8%. Again, newer practices, because the collections are low, that rent figure is a little bit higher early on, and so your percentage might be well over 9%. And so you're trying to set that goal. When we look at rent and we look at your practice, what we advise is, per op, you're doing about $250 in collections, right? So if I have a practice with 5 ops, I'm looking at 1.25 in collections for the year, right? To optimize my space, to cover that rent cost, so that my margins, right, my profitability and that KPI is in the green.
And we all know that rent's going up every year. It's going up. Those costs are going up. Property taxes are going up and everything. So that's every time we talk about trying to control that cost, the doctors come back and say, okay, well, it keeps going up. It keeps going up, right? But in this KPI, as Hamza was talking about, though, you have to think inverse, right? Okay, like if you want to bring that percentage down, you can't control the rent. You can't control the triple net, but what can you control? You can control the collections. You can control the revenue that's driving it, which is going to bring your percentage down and make your practice look a lot more attractive to a buyer. The other one that he made about marketing, and this is something that always surprises most people when you talk to them, like, what do you mean marketing doesn't have a fixed cost? Well, the reason we put in fixed cost is because you shouldn't be marketing. You should be marketing every month, every year, depending on whatever stage of the practice you're at. It is a cost of business, And you must count it as a fixed cost. You must count it as the fact that that money's already gone. If you're not doing that, then you're not going to see the steady growth, right? And the practice. So that's why in our heads we consider a fixed cost, because the cost of doing business, of staying alive and growing and maturing in this very competitive time and age that the market's at.
And that kind of transitions us to our last KPI I want to talk about, which actually is a very, very important KPI, which is EBITDA, which for the viewers who don't know what that stands for, that's earnings before income tax, depreciation, and amortization.
I didn't hear that. Can you say it again?
It's income before taxes, depreciation, and amortization. This is just a fancy way of saying how much income are you making, when you take out non-cash expenses, right?
How many doctors understood that?
And probably zero. But it's funny because we get this question all the time when we're talking to clients of how much is my practice valued, right? What's the value of my practice? And this EBITDA figure is the answer to that, right? And so, we have that as a KPI because if EBITDA is good, right? And, if we take a step back and if all these other 4 KPIs we mentioned are great, that means EBITDA is increased. And if EBITDA increased, that increases the valuation of your practice. I'll let Omar talk a little bit more about how that affects your valuation, but EBITDA, for our viewers who always ask, how good is my practice doing and what is my value in my practice? This is very important KPI to measure. And that basically answers that question for you guys.
Yeah, and so your biggest asset is your practice, right? So your biggest asset is your biggest income producing mechanism, right? You want it to be worth, more than you bought it for or more than you built it for, right? And so the EBITDA is going to be the driver behind that. We will always tell our clients that, and we focus on specifically with our CFO clients, is the fact that monitoring that KPI for EBITDA on a monthly basis, because you never know if you need to sell the practice tomorrow, you have a family situation, you have to move. You always want your practice, your best asset to be worth the best at any point in time. For example, if you own a property, right? If you want to be able to sell the property at any point in time. Now, if you have, neglected that property, right, for the last 5 years where the paint is peeling and the parking lot lines aren't, there, and the windows are old and everything is, all shabby, then all of a sudden, now you need to sell it. And now you gotta start, doing a lot of work to clean it up. It's hard to, get that turned around, specifically with a business, much easier than a real estate property, right? So you always want to be the best case scenario, be in the driver's seat by monitoring your EBITDA on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, on a quarterly basis. So the fact that at all points in time, what your practice is worth on the street, right? And that way the cards are in your hands. Monitoring and managing and having an optimal EBITDA KPI is all about managing those other 4 KPIs above that, right? And so one of the things that we love about the dental business is the fact that, in my mind, it's a beautiful business, and the reason is because there's knobs that you can turn. I can start returning collections, and all of a sudden then the profitability goes up, and the practice goes up in value by 20% in 1 year. For $1 million practice, that's $200,000 increase in value over a course of a year, right? I can drive down variable costs by bringing a lab in house. I can increase profitability by shifting the marketing strategy, right? There's so many things that can be done that will all affect the bottom line, which is EBITDA, and affect the value of the office. It's your biggest asset. So that is something you want to be tracking on a monthly basis, not trying to clean house, right before you sell. You always want to look attractive to banks, want to look attractive to other potential buyers, because you always want to be open and always want to have your door open for opportunity. Or the fact that you may have another opportunity that comes up and you need funding from a bank, and they look at your practice and they're like, well, we're not going to give you anything, any kind of line of credit or any kind of a lending against this, right? But if I have a polished practice that my financials are in order, my EBITDAs are on track, I know my numbers, my KPIs look all awesome, and I go to the bank with those financials, right? I have a much better chance of being able to leverage that practice to get a line of credit, to get a loan, or even sell that office if I need to, right? It just puts you in the best position. Like in the world of dentistry, you don't want to, you don't want to get into a case scenario where, you need to have a extraction and have implants done. You want to catch it at the cavity stage, right? It's easier to fix, less costly to fix, right? And easier to turn the ship around versus when we've been running a practice with subpar EBITDA, means we're making less money for the work that we're putting in. The business is worth less, right? And we've set a habit. And when you set a habit in business, it becomes very hard to change, because not just you, but your people and your systems and your processes and your infrastructure are all used to that habit. And that habit becomes part of your culture. Because part of your culture, it becomes part of ingrained within the business, almost like a cavity that gets the root. Now to go and change that, it takes a lot more effort. Versus if we're constantly looking at things and we're constantly polishing things, we're constantly doing our cleanings, we're constantly doing our checkups, right? Then it's a lot easier problem to tackle in the turning dentistry, right? Dentistry applies to business too. So that's kind of my take on EBITDA.
I think that shows the importance of EBITDA, and I think we talked to a lot of clients and they know about the word EBITDA, but not exactly sure the ins and outs of it. And so I think that was greatly explained. To kind of recap today's episode, we talked about the top 5 KPIs, right? Our Fab 5, if you will, which was collections, staff cost, variable cost, fixed cost, and last but not least, EBITDA. We really believe that if you're not having this discussion with your advisor on a month-to-month basis, you definitely should be. These 5 KPIs, and you're looking at these things, they'll drive up the value of your practice, right? The profitability of your practice, which is whatever every dentist is asking us how to do, right? And so thank you for joining us today in our episode. I was glad it was great talking about these KPIs, and yeah, looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you.